Hello and welcome. I'm Alicia Bannon, Director of the Judiciary Program at the Brennan Center for Justice and Editor-in-Chief of State Court Report, a website dedicated to state courts and state constitutional development. Across the country, state constitutional amendments and other major changes to state law are on the ballot. About half of all states allow for some form of direct democracy, where voters can change state laws through initiatives or referenda. And that includes 17 states that provide for initiative processes for state constitutional amendments. And even in states without direct democracy provisions, proposed state constitutional amendments almost always have to go before voters. So what's on the ballot this year, and what are we seeing with respect to efforts to rein in direct democracy? Those are some of the key questions that we'll be addressing at this special event by the Brennan Center for Justice and State Court Report. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping notes. The Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy organization that works to repair, revitalize, and defend our systems of democracy and justice so they work for all Americans. While we cannot support or oppose any candidate for office, we will offer you vigorous debates on the policies and positions that matter for our democracy. Civility is important to all of us. Those who post rude or inappropriate language in our message stream on YouTube will be removed from the conversation. Live closed captioning will be provided, and you can follow along with the conversation on social media with the hashtag BrennanCenterLive. Now, let's get started with today's program. Please join me in welcoming Amanda Becker, the Washington correspondent for the 19th and author of the new book, You Must Stand Up: The Fight for Abortion Rights in Post-Dobbs America. She was a 2023 fellow at the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard University and has covered multiple presidential elections and House and Senate campaigns, as well as the U.S. Supreme Court. Alice Klapman is senior counsel in the Brennan Center's Democracy Program, where her work focuses on voting rights. During this election cycle, she has written about attacks on direct democracy. Before joining the Brennan Center, Alice was a litigator specializing in reproductive rights. John Matsusaka is the Charles F. Sexton Chair in American Enterprise, Professor of Finance and Business Economics, and the Executive Director of Initiative and Referendum of the Initiative and Referendum Institute, all at the USC Marshall School of Business. He's the author of Let the People Rule: How Direct Democracy Can Meet the Populist Challenge. Thank you all for joining us and agreeing to share your valuable insights. Now, as a reminder to our audience, please ask your questions in the chat. We've saved time for questions at the end, and we may ask our experts to answer relevant questions as they come up during the conversation as well. So John, I'm going to start with you. Direct democracy is one of the ways that many states operate very differently than our national government, than the feds. Can you talk to us about where direct democracy comes from? What's the background and the origins, and how has it been used by voters?
Thanks, Alicia. It's great to be here. This is a great event. I'm excited to be here. It's a perfect question to start it, because I think direct democracy tends to be a little bit confusing to some people about what exactly it is. So what we're really talking about is ballot propositions where people are going in and voting directly on laws. And so that's called direct democracy as opposed to representative democracy, because again, our typical representative democracy that we think of, we elect people and they go make the laws for us, whereas in direct democracy, we make the laws directly. So it turns out this is something that's been going on in the United States since the very beginning, literally. One state actually had a referendum. They put it up to a vote whether they should actually ratify the U.S. Constitution. So literally from the foundation of the Republic, people were using direct democracy. So that was obviously a special case. What then happened during the 1800s is states started to adopt their own constitutions, and they realized that probably we should put these constitutions to votes rather than just have a convention self-ratify. And then it became accepted practice that anytime you would have an amendment to a constitution, that should go to the voters as well. So we really shouldn't have elected officials unilaterally making decisions about what the Constitution is. We should put it to the voters. So that century went on. Power started to expand. There were some defaults in the 19th century where states loaned out money and then defaulted and left the taxpayers on the hook. So then states started requiring votes on bond issues and so forth. So there was this continual and gradual holding of votes by voters. The probably the most dramatic development happened in the very late 1800s and early 20th century during what's called the progressive movement, when reformers went one step further. Prior to that period, anytime the voters voted on an issue, it was something that was proposed by the legislatures. What happened is in the early 1900s, during the progressive movement, something called the initiative and referendum were adopted. And these substantially expanded the scope of direct democracy because they allowed citizens to vote not just on things that the legislature put up to a vote, but also on things the citizens themselves wanted to vote on. So the idea is that citizens could go around and collect signatures, and if they got enough signatures, they could put it to a vote. So that's essentially where we stand now. And just the last thing on the context, there's one thing which is a very common theme of all of these forms of direct democracy, and the reason that they exist, the reason that we don't have a purely representative democracy and never have, and that is because the citizens have always felt that although we elect representatives and we have some ability to make them accountable, it doesn't always work perfectly. Sometimes they don't listen to the voters. Sometimes they're beholden more than we would like to special interests. And it was felt that it's useful in a system, in a democratic system with representatives, it's useful to have a safety check so that sometimes if they get out of line, there's ways for the voters to come in and correct it. So that's where we stand today.
Thank you. That's really helpful context as we look to what's on the ballot this year. So to that end, I'm going to pull in Amanda to talk next about one of the trends that we've been seeing with respect to what's on the ballot relates to abortion rights. So this year, 10 states have abortion-related measures on the ballot. Most of them are citizen-driven initiatives. So Amanda, can you talk to us about why these initiatives have been such a prominent way of protecting abortion rights post-Dobbs, and also how amendments that have been on the ballot in previous years have fared?
Yeah, so let's start with the previous amendments. There's been 7 so far. Most of them were to protect abortion rights in some way. A couple were to add provisions to the state constitution to restrict abortion. And in every single case so far, abortion rights has won. So they either passed the measure protecting abortion rights or they defeated the measure wanting to constrict or restrict abortion rights. This year, as you said, there are 10, and the vast majority of them are citizen referred. And all of those in citizen referred areas are places where, to some degree, and it really varies, the state legislator is out of touch with voters on the topic of abortion and the subject of abortion. And as he was just explaining, this form of direct democracy is a way for the electorate to correct when they feel that the elected officials have got out of hand and aren't representing their interests. And so, there's one in the state of Arizona, for example. Arizona is a state where the majority of the electorate wants legal access to abortion. They currently have a 15-week ban in place, but it has been incredibly chaotic in the state of Arizona since Dobbs came out. In those first days and weeks, there were actually 3 different laws on the books restricting abortion. One was a pre-statehood law from when Arizona was a territory that was a full ban. Another one was fetal personhood language that was in state law. And then the 15-week ban that they'd passed relatively recently. And so they were in a state of legal flux up into this year. So right now, that measure is polling phenomenally well. It's been up into the 70s in some polls, and that is slated to pass. Now, you also see initiatives in states like Maryland and New York, where the legislature has actually referred the ballot initiative. In those cases, it's elected officials responding again to what the voters are saying they want, because those are states where, the vast majority of people, of voters, want protection for abortion. And what voters have realized in the years since Dobbs is that sometimes a law is not enough, right? It could be overturned. It could go up to the state Supreme Court. It could go through the federal court system if there's a conflict with a federal law. And so even in states where abortion is legally protected, we're seeing pushes to actually put it into the state constitution, because constitutions are much more difficult to change than laws are.
Thank you so much. I'll ask one follow-up question. I'm curious, have you seen changes in the strategies between, I guess 2022 and 2023, and then what we're seeing now? And I guess the one I'm thinking of in particular is Nebraska, where we're seeing kind of dueling constitutional amendments on the ballot right now.
Yeah, so Nebraska is a really interesting one. And I actually looked into what happens if they pass both of these. And it turns out that the answer is the one with the most votes, the most support will go into effect. Because look, ballot measure language can be incredibly confusing. And that's why we're seeing legal battles ahead of stuff even getting onto ballots between, anti-abortion officials who want to make it more confusing to pass, and for abortion rights supporting groups that want to make it very clear that this is, what this would be doing.
And in Nebraska, just to be clear, there's one measure that's backed by abortion rights groups, and then another that sort of purports to be an abortion rights amendment, but is actually restrictive.
Yes. And so, in some cases in politics, and that's what we're seeing play out on, in these ballot measure fights, confusion can be strategy, right? And if you can get people confused, and when I was writing my book, I was examining a ballot measure related to abortion in Kentucky, and just looking at how difficult it can be to understand some of these. Sometimes it requires not only a high school education, but a couple of years of college to get to the literacy level to understand some ballot measures. And so, confusion is a part of the point sometimes for these ballot measure fights. And, it will be really interesting to see. I've been talking to the abortion rights groups that are supporting a lot of these ballot measures. They say they have a path to victory in all states on which they're on ballots right now. The most difficult will be Florida, because it is the only place where it will require reaching a 60% threshold to pass.
Thank you so much. Alice, I'm going to turn to you now to talk about another trend that we've seen with respect to state ballots, which are measures that are focused on making changes to election procedures, voting laws and rights, and also tackling gerrymandering. So can you talk to us today about some of the democracy-related measures that you are watching this year?
Sure, Alicia. This is a really big election for democracy, particularly in Ohio, where citizens have put issue 1 on the ballot, which is a redistricting initiative. So Ohio has one of the most gerrymandered legislatures in the country. And that gerrymandering has really distorted state lawmaking on, as Amanda mentioned, abortion and other issues. And the Ohio Constitution actually prohibits partisan gerrymandering, but the legislature has just ignored that rule and passed map after map that is just straight up partisan gerrymandering. And unfortunately, the state Supreme Court has let them do this. And so citizens and advocates, after years of trying to get relief in state court and losing, these citizens, including 2 former state Supreme Court justices, have decided to take matters into their own hands and put an initiative forth that would take redistricting completely out of legislators' hands. And in fact, out of the hands of any elected or appointed official who has a reason to gerrymander. So this independent commission that issue 1 would create is similar to ones that are in place in Arizona, California, Colorado, and Michigan, all of which were citizen initiated. Not surprisingly, and which have been shown to improve the fairness of state lawmaking. Gerrymandering reform is really popular. As you can imagine, citizens want to choose their own representatives. They don't want their vote minimized by gerrymandering. So these initiatives poll well. The real problem in Ohio, and this is picking up on a theme you've heard, is that in Ohio, state politics, and particularly the Secretary of State and a ballot board is able to put language on the ballot describing the initiative. And the language that the state has put is Orwellian in how misleading it is. It really actually looks like the initiative would allow gerrymandering instead of preventing it. And we've already seen that cause some voter confusion. So we're watching that really closely to see how that plays out. In the anti-voter category, I would just throw out, Arizona, North Dakota, where the legislatures there are pushing back on the citizen initiative process by asking voters to approve 2 measures that would make it harder to put ballot initiatives on citizen initiatives on the ballot. And North Dakota is going one step further and asking citizens to approve language in the Constitution that would require them to pass future ballot initiatives twice before they could take effect. So really a lot of democracy issues on the ballot this year.
That's so interesting. And with the Ohio example, I think Amanda's point about confusion can be strategy is one of the themes that we're seeing in a lot of places. I think it's very striking how much power elected officials often have in crafting that language, and there often aren't very strong safeguards there.
Absolutely, and people trust what they're seeing on the ballot. They think that it's neutral, so that's a real issue.
Amanda, did you want to jump in as well?
Yeah, I just, now that you've brought up Ohio, I grew up in Ohio, so I follow Ohio really closely. And, when Alice was talking about ballot measures to make passing ballot measures more difficult, they actually tried that in Ohio. After Dobbs, they, were kind of looking at the electorate. They knew that, when I say they, I mean the elected officials in state government, in the state house and statewide office. They knew that if the abortion rights groups got a ballot measure to protect abortion onto Ohio ballots, it was probably going to pass because more than 50% of Ohioans said that they wanted it. So they actually brought back a special election that they had just gotten rid of in Ohio to vote on a measure from the legislature that would have made it both more difficult to get ballot measures onto ballots and to pass them as a kind of preemptive assault on the effort to pass the abortion rights amendment. Now, Ohioans defeated that and they went on to pass the abortion rights amendment. It turned out if there was anything more popular than the abortion rights amendment with Ohio voters, it was making sure that they preserved their right to have ballot measures and get them onto ballot. So that was an effort that we saw last year in Ohio that failed.
Thank you for that. And I'll put on my state court report hat for a second. I think all of these are really interesting examples of the power and importance of state courts in both directions. So you had, so in Ohio, with respect to partisan gerrymandering, you had some positive court decisions that were essentially ignored by the redistricting commissions and legislatures in the state. You've had these measures put on the ballot with confusing language that the state Supreme Court has authorized and allowed to go forward. And even the off-cycle election was something that, again, was challenged in court, and the court allowed it to go forward. So courts are playing a really important role in many of these discussions as well. John, I want to turn back to you. We've talked about a couple of different trends. We've talked about abortion rights on the ballot. We've talked about some of the democracy issues on the ballot. What are other trends that you're noticing among the states, where there may be similar initiatives or similar themes that are emerging? Johnny?
Sorry about that.
Great.
Dealing with my mutes. So I think you hit the two biggest trends that I've seen have already been mentioned. One is abortion issues, and the other is election related issues. We should talk more about kind of these election related issues, because I think it's really important understanding how voters try to process these issues and the complications they face. There's sometimes a feeling that people's views on direct democracy have to do with their political orientation. And so, just to give an example, we see a lot of measures being proposed by progressives recently, and progressives have been winning. And so nowadays we see progressives like direct democracy. But I've been doing this long enough. It was 20, 30 years ago, there were a lot of conservative types of issues, and the conservatives loved it and the progressives hated it. One thing that is perennial is that elected officials don't like direct democracy, and they tend to propose laws and they try to chip away at it. And we've heard some of these things here, and this is one of the things that I do think we need to monitor, and pay attention to as voters, in that elected officials, for a variety of reasons, don't seem to like citizens making laws directly. And so they're often trying to propose ways to curtail the process. If they can do it themselves, they might do it by trying to obfuscate ballot language, as we heard about in Ohio in this crazy case where they've, there's a measure that's trying to really stop gerrymandering, and the ballot description says it's a gerrymandering, it's allowing gerrymandering. But the important thing to note is that this is, I really think it's important for people to understand that there's no ideological orientation to direct democracy. It's liberals, it's conservative, it's any group that feels they don't have a say can get their word out. And the reason I'm just mentioning that is because there's been a lot of Republican attempts in red states recently to curtail the initiative process, but we also see these attempts to curtail the initiative process in blue states as well. So in California, we have had a number of equally terrible attempts to manipulate ballot language by Democratic officials. So this is kind of a bipartisan issue, which is unfortunate. But going back to the question, there's a lot of abortion rights related issues. There's a lot of election law related issues. Curiously enough, there's a number of states that are voting on citizenship issues, which are essentially declaring that only American citizens can vote in elections. I don't quite understand what's the reason for these, because it seems like kind of a small issue, but there you have it. We have a number of states continue to vote on marijuana legalization of various forms. This has been an issue that's been popular for 20 years or so now. It seems like we're just about saturated. Pretty much every state that's going to do it has done it. In the elections category, there is also a number of states that are voting on primary elections and things like ranked choice voting elections, which come into play as well. This has been a very popular issue in the last 10 years or so, and we're seeing a number of states trying to do that. And then predictably, we're seeing some pushbacks against that, some attempts to undo that and go back. But as well as these trends, it's also useful to just remember that a lot of the issues that we see on the ballot are very localized issues. They're super important to people in that particular state, but they may not have a national trend. And I'll just mention one and then stop. But there's a proposition in California this year, Proposition 33. Right now, the way the state runs for rent control is that there's a state law about rent control, but local governments are not allowed to override the state law. So there's a proposal to essentially allow local governments to set their own rent control laws. And there's been a phenomenal amount of money spent on this so far. Over $160 million has been spent on this so far. It's one of the two most expensive in the country this year. Most of it coming from realtors associations, as you would expect.
That's fascinating. Going back to your point about how there's nothing fundamentally kind of progressive or conservative about ballot initiatives. What is your sense as to why we may be seeing more initiatives that are kind of more progressive oriented now versus in the past?
So I think you usually see initiatives when you see a state legislature get out of alignment with its voters, and that often happens when a state becomes not just a majority of one party, but a super strong majority of one party, and then the party tends to get captured by its fringes. And so those are things one could argue would be some, I don't want to, I'd have to go into a specific detail of a specific state to say exactly when it happens, but it has the feel of the sort of things we've seen on some of these abortion issues. But we also see similar things like this happening in very blue states, like California, where you see very progressive things that the Democrats have put forward, really based on pressure from their union allies that the voters have repealed as well. So why do we see these things now? If you actually look, you'll see both. You'll see both progressive and conservative issues across the country. I think maybe the abortion ones have been getting, abortion, minimum wage, some of these things have been getting a lot of press, maybe because they're more visible nationally. I think that what's happened with abortion is that you've seen a number of really red states go too far. It's conceivable it could go the other way. If you look at opinion polls, voters are very much in the center, in my reading of polls, on abortion. They want abortion to be legal sometime in the first trimester. They're very uncomfortable with flat out abortion in the last trimester. And so if you look at opinion polls, you'll see a distribution with a lot of people in the middle. What's happened is a lot of red states have pushed way too far in the conservative direction, and the voters are turning that over. If you saw blue states going too far in the other direction, I'm sure you would see some conservative groups come in and try to push it back to the center as well.
Thank you for that, Amanda. I'm gonna turn to you again now. You've been reporting on different political races and issues this year, and obviously covering and following these ballot measures as well. To what extent do you think the ballot measures, particularly with respect to abortion rights, are on voters' radar? I'm thinking about your point about confusion being strategy. Is more education needed? What are you seeing in the landscape in the states?
Yeah. So first of all, they are on voters' radar. And I think that, that's a natural effect of both jobs. Abortion as an issue is dominating political discussion, and, broader issues related to reproductive health and gender are dominating the entire discussion in the presidential race, in Senate races, in House races, in state House races, and governor's races. So it's only natural that they would have, I think, a greater level of understanding and knowledge about the fact that there are abortion measures out there, particularly if they're in a state that has one. Now, that's not to say that they necessarily will know what the words mean when they get into the ballot booth. When I was following canvassers ahead of the Kentucky ballot measure, and abortion was already banned in Kentucky legislatively when this was happening. So this was going to be an extra move to add that ban into the state constitution. It was the Saturday before voting, so they were 3 days out. They were going to houses that they thought were likely no votes, so people who supported abortion rights. That ballot measure was actually pretty straightforward as they go. It came after a ballot measure that was about this long on the ballot, trying to get my hands into the screen there. And they were still getting last minute questions of voters saying, things like, oh, I've been hearing about this, but I didn't quite understand what it means. I don't understand the signs. And I just, I will never forget one man saying, just tell me how I vote to support women's rights. And they said no. And then he said, thanks, have a nice day. So while I think that there's a voter, there's a level of, knowledge among the electorate that these ballot measures exist, I think depending on the state, the language of the ballot measure, there's still probably a fair amount of education to be done about what they mean. And I think that would only be even more so on the non-abortion related ballot measures.
Thanks for that. John, can I pull you in too?
Yes, just follow up on that. One of the biggest challenges of doing direct democracy is getting voters information about what they're voting on. And we actually know there's a good side and a bad side to this. We actually know pretty well how voters make their decisions on these issues. And what we know, first of all, they don't read the text of the law ever. They don't understand it. They don't even try to. If you quiz them, what are the details of a law? They fail abysmally. That's not how they do it. What they do is they search around for some buddy organization person that they trust, and they ask them, "What do you think?" So we just heard Amanda just mentioned, if you're a pro-choice person, then you go to a pro-choice group and say, "Look, I don't know. Don't tell me the details. Just tell me which way to vote." Or if you're a pro-life person, you can go to that group and say, "Just tell me." And what we know is actually that's the way voters decide. That bothers some people. It doesn't actually bother me because that's the way we make a lot of decisions in life. We take advice from experts. We go take we take drugs from our doctor. We follow recommendations of doctors when we take drugs. There's a whole bunch of things. We look at recommendations. We go online and look at reviews of products and stuff. And so that's okay. But what it means to make democracy work, though, is we have to make sure that there's a rich array of information. What these are called queues or shortcuts. There has to be a lot of advisors out there so people can find the group that's aligned with their interest that actually goes and reads the law and says, here, if you want to do this, vote this way. As long as we can do that, it's pretty much okay. And as long as they can get their word out. So there need to be groups, and there needs to be a way for the groups to sort of get their message out so the voters who are trying to find somebody on their side can find it.
Thank you. Alice, would you like to jump in as well?
Sure. I wanted to just push back slightly. I agreed with most of that. Certainly people look to trusted groups and associates for information about ballot initiatives. And I agree that that is actually probably a good way to make decisions on this. I want to make a distinction between reading the actual amendment and reading the description on the ballot, because I think while people don't tend to read the kind of nitty gritty language of how, and say a constitution would be amended, they do look at the short description on the ballot. And so when states, state actors tweak with that language and make it misleading, that can actually confuse voters.
Thank you for that. John, did you want to respond? You're on mute. Oh, I think we may have lost John momentarily, so I am going to just turn to our next question, and hopefully he'll be able to rejoin us in a minute. Alice, I'm going to turn to you. We've talked a bit about this already. I think to John's point about how ballot initiatives are popular with the public and not always very popular with state legislatures or other government actors. Can you talk more about ways that you've seen all kinds of state actors? So it could be, legislatures, governors, but also other state actors as well. How they may be trying to limit direct democracy or limit the efficacy of direct democracy measures. Are there any particular kinds of attacks on direct democracy that you're particularly focused on?
Sure, and I hope John rejoins us. So, as we've been saying, sometimes the legislatures don't like to give up their power, just like voters don't like to give up their power. And so sometimes legislatures try to make the initiative process harder. They may try to increase signature requirements. They may try to require that citizens gather signatures from every county in the state, for example, or a higher percentage of signatures. They may, as we've been talking about a little bit, try to require a higher threshold for a ballot measure to pass, which generally fails. But for example, in Florida and Arizona, they had some success with that. Oftentimes states, if they try to do it on their own, legislatures unilaterally, oftentimes state courts say, no, you need voter approval. So that's where, as Amanda was talking about, they may come to voters and try to get them to approve these types of restrictions. But as you mentioned, Alicia, it's really not just legislatures. We see there's a range of actors in the system who play a role in the whole process of an initiative going onto the ballot and coming up for a vote. And that ranges from governors to secretaries of state to boards of canvassers to attorneys general. And all of these officials have a hand in the process. And some of them abuse that role to try to thwart specific initiatives. So, and I would say like the states where this has been most blatant recently would be Ohio, Arizona, North Dakota, Missouri, Florida, and Arkansas. We have seen attorneys general in several states refuse to certify ballot initiatives. Both attorneys general and secretary of state sometimes have to certify, depending on the state, that the signatures are valid, that the language of the initiative follows certain requirements. And we have seen political actors use that role to try to refuse to certify initiatives. We have seen them, we've talked a lot today, so I won't belabor the point about misleading descriptions on ballots. But we have seen even beyond that, taxpayer-funded advertisements, for example, in Florida, aimed at dissuading people from approving the reproductive rights measure there. We have even seen the use of law enforcement in Florida to sort of intimidate people who signed petitions for the initiative there. So in some states, so this has really there's been a kind of very active effort to thwart initiatives even beyond just legislatures. In some states, the courts have been very vigorous in pushing back on that, particularly Montana, Utah, and Missouri And, you know, some of this, as I mentioned, is on the ballot even this year in Arizona and North Dakota, whether citizens will give up some of their power and agree to make it harder to pass future initiatives. So that's, I'll stop there. Those are just a few examples of efforts to thwart ballot initiatives and sort of throw sand in the gears of the process.
That's super helpful. Amanda, did you want to jump in with any other examples that you've seen?
Yeah, I was just going to add, in Florida, the administration of Governor DeSantis has actually also sued television stations, or threatened to sue, for showing the commercials about the abortion ballot measure, saying that they have disinformation in them and a variety of things. And so far, none of the stations have stopped running these. They're, reminding them, we have this thing called the First Amendment in this country, and a judge has as well. But that was just kind of another unprecedented, really, step that we saw in Florida to try and limit kind of their ability to educate the public about that ballot measure.
That's a really powerful example. And, just sort of speaking to the role, to courts and judges and the role that they play in all of this. Alex, could I ask you to talk also about there were two significant state Supreme Court decisions just this year that related to issues around popular sovereignty in Utah and Pennsylvania. Could you tell us a little bit about those cases and the role that state courts are playing around some of these direct democracy questions?
Sure. So yes, as you're mentioning, Alicia, courts in Utah and Michigan just issued landmark decisions on the interplay between citizen power to enact statutes and the legislature's power to pass laws as well. So in some states, for example, Utah, citizens can initiate a constitutional amendment, but they can change, they can pass statutes, sort of like, just like a legislature can. And so there has been a question in some states of what happens when citizens and legislators are at odds on the laws that they want to pass. So in Utah, citizens wanted to pass anti-gerrymandering laws. And in Michigan, they wanted to pass worker protections like minimum wage increases. And in both states, the legislature disagreed. And they, in various similar ways, took steps to basically repeal the law that the citizens were passing. And so the court was really both courts were faced with the question of, like, when these two actors both have the power to make law, what happens when they make conflicting law? And what both courts held in slightly different ways is that the constitutions in those states have popular sovereignty at their core. And what that means, and citizen initiative processes are harder. A legislature just gets together and passes a law. For citizens, it's a very prolonged, expensive, difficult process of gathering the signatures, qualifying for the ballot, et cetera. So when citizens go through the effort of doing that, those laws trump the legislature. The legislature can't, or there are limits on how the legislature can come in and change the laws after the citizens have spoken. So that's a very broad description of what those courts said recently. Happy to dig into details if there's time.
Thank you so much for that. I want to make sure we leave some time for questions from our audience. So I'm going to turn to some of the questions that were put in the chat. Keep them coming, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. I guess the first question I'm going to pose to anyone in the group that would like to take it on, we've been talking about confusing language in ballot initiatives. Are there any measures in particular that are concerning you for being intentionally worded to confuse and obfuscate the intention of the intention of the initiative?
I can start. We've already mentioned the Nebraska amendments. There's one that would protect abortion. There's one that would not protect abortion and, in fact, ban it. But it has some language that could make, a person just giving it a once over think that that's the abortion rights measure. And I think anytime you have two competing ballot measures, that's going to be really confusing for voters. So that's one that I have my eye on. There's also a competing couplet of ballot measures in Arizona related to opening up the partisan primary system. That's a state that also has been gerrymandered, like many of our states. And so they're getting, you know, kind of an increasingly, you could say, polarized candidates getting to the general election, because a third of the electorate in Arizona is not a registered Democrat or a registered Republican. They're an independent, so they're currently not able to participate. And so those are two ballot measures that are, again, in direct competition. And I just wonder in those cases whether a voter truly knows which one they're voting for when they're casting those votes.
Thanks. Would anyone else like to jump in?
I'll jump in and just mention sort of the court saving voters from a misleading initiative recently in Utah, where after the court stepped in and said, no, legislature, you can't simply repeal citizen initiatives except under certain circumstances, the legislature tried to put the issue back to voters. And the court found that the language that they were using to do that was misleading, and so that they couldn't, couldn't put that on the ballot this year.
John, anything you'd want to add?
Well, the Ohio issue 1 is the one that comes to mind. It's so clearly confusing. You're going to have to, anybody who reads it will be confused. So we're going to have to rely on them getting enough endorsements for it to work. And we're going to put to the test how well that's going to actually work, because the language is terrible.
And that's the partisan gerrymandering.
Yeah, that's the gerrymandering one. Yeah.
That's great. All right, I'll turn to another question, which I think I'll open to the group, which is, there's a question: some proposed amendments seem designed to take power from one branch and give it to another, such as limiting a governor's power to declare an emergency. Is that a typical use of ballot measures?
So I'll just throw out something. It's anything under, if you go back far enough, anything under the sun has been on the ballot, but that is not a particularly common type of thing. The most common things tend to be tax-related issues. There's tons and tons of those. That would probably be number one. Issues having to do with elections, campaigns, primaries, that's a really big one. And then a smattering of social issues. So you will see those things trying to adjust power between branches, but I think they're relatively rare. I suspect that they're just, it's hard to see who's really going to fund those things when it really comes down to it, because it takes money to put some of these things on the ballot. They're very kind of, I think, obscure for a lot of people.
Great. Anyone else want to add thoughts, or I can move to another question? All right, we'll keep it moving. Should there be any voter turnout requirements for measures to pass? So, for example, should we pass constitutional amendments with if there's only 20% turnout, for example?
So some states have rules like that say you need 40% of the people to turn, 40% or something like that. I personally think it's not a good idea to have those sort of requirements, because what happens is it makes abstention. Your voters get confronted with a tricky choice. Should I vote no, or should I not vote at all? And I don't think you want to put voters in strategic situations like that, because then we don't know what those votes really mean. I think if you want to make it harder for amendments to pass, which I think might be a good idea, perhaps. I'm always a little uncomfortable with 51% rules for constitutional amendments, because it seems like maybe it should be a little harder. If you want to do something like that, if you want to make it a little harder, I think there's ways to do it that don't encourage people not to vote. And again, we had some discussion earlier about some of these states that are trying to make it harder. Ohio last year tried to make it harder to approve constitutional amendments. I think in principle, that's not a bad idea. I think in principle, it's not a bad idea to say you have to approve amendments twice, which is what Nevada does. So in principle, I think those are all not bad ideas, perhaps, but I think they're being used strategically right now to achieve policy ends, not out of a principle about what makes a good way to do governance.
Yeah, I'll add to that if I can, which is that I agree in principle, some sort of limitations on how easy it is to, for example, amend the Constitution makes sense in a system where representative democracy is functioning well. And I think the real problem in our system right now is between, campaign finance, the complete lack of any campaign finance laws, and partisan gerrymandering, we have a very imperfect representative democracy right now, which really puts pressure on citizen initiatives to improve the laws, and so makes it harder to say it's a good idea to cut back on that.
So moving to another question, do any states have intermediary bodies like the Electoral College between voters and the outcome? John, you're shaking your head.
No. I mean, you go and you vote yes or no, and majority rules or supermajority rules. That's it, as far as I know. I'm not sure what. Maybe I'm misunderstanding the question, but I've never heard of anything like that.
Well, maybe could we step back and maybe could you give an overview of maybe some more of the different structural differences between states and how direct democracy provisions operates? You mentioned supermajority requirements or things where it has to, go before voters more than once potentially, or go before the legislature more than once. Could you sort of walk us through some of the differences that you see between states?
Sure, it's federalism, so there's almost like an infinite number of things, right? So there's variation in how you qualify things for the ballot. So states might vary in how many signatures do you need, and how much time do you have to collect signatures, and can you collect them all from one place, or do you have to get them distributed across the state? Then there's variation in approval rules. Do you need a majority? Do you need 60%? Do you need to approve it twice? There's differences in whether you can propose constitutional amendments or ordinary statutes. We talked a little bit about there's differences in how you can amend things. So suppose the voters pass a statute to a tax cut, let's say. Can the legislature amend that? In California, the legislature can't touch it. It has to go back to the voters for approval if you want to touch a statutory initiative. Other states, the legislature can amend it. Some states say, well, okay, they can amend it after 3 years or after 5 years. Others say, well, they can amend it, but it takes a supermajority. There's a ton of variation on that. There's also issues about how many sort of legal types of issues that come into play, like how many subjects, what subjects can be considered on a ballot proposition. So there's something called a single subject rule that many states have that says an initiative can embrace only a single subject, which is a contentious issue because nobody knows what it means. Some states limit the topics that can be voted on. Massachusetts says, for example, you can't vote on things having to do with religion. Wyoming says you can't appropriate money. So there's a variety of other things like there. And I could go on and on and on, but the picture is there's a lot of different ways to do democracy. And I think the states have availed themselves of, I guess, customizing the processes to ways that make sense to them.
That's fascinating. Amanda, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to also remind everyone, because not everyone realizes this, I've realized in reporting on this, that not every state has a citizen-referred ballot measure process. So only, I think it's 26 states do, but if you're in one of the 24 states that doesn't, this is not a form of direct democracy available to you. And for example, in the abortion context, a lot of the states with the most restrictive laws are in the US South. Those also are states that disproportionately do not have a citizen-referred ballot measure process. So when I'm talking to voters, sometimes it comes up as, well, why doesn't just every state do this? Why doesn't the voters just do it state by state? And the answer is they would still only get to about half the country doing it that way. Because if you're in a state like Alabama, for example, where a big part of my book was set, that is not something that's on the table for you right now.
That's a great point and a great addition. I'm going to turn to another question. Is there a ballot measure that comes to mind that has had the most impact historically? So if you're sort of lifting up, significant ballot measures over time, what are some examples you might give?
Well, I'll start. The one that comes to my mind is a proposition called Proposition 13 in California from 1978, which was a tax cutting measure that was believed to kind of set off a tax revolt nationwide, the era of the end of the New Deal era, whatever that is, of spending that was believed to lead to a kind of a retrenchment in government. Many states followed by starting to cut their taxes and limit their spending as well. And it was believed that it had effects on the national race. President Ronald Reagan won the presidency in 1980 and tried to implement things like that. So that's one that was believed to have had a lot of spillovers outside the state.
Anyone else have examples to add? I'll note something that I found interesting when I was looking at different measures on the ballot. You know, in the early 2000s, there were a whole slate of anti-marriage equality measures on the ballot, and you know, became a big organizing issue. You know, in our national politics, a big. You had George W. Bush campaigning on these issues. And now this year, there are, I believe, 3 states that are seeking to repeal those anti-marriage equality amendments from their state constitutions, you know, with the overlay that, you know, we have a state Supreme Court that or US Supreme Court where, you know, marriage equality may not be seen as reliably protected with the current supermajority on the court. And so people are looking to these looking at their state constitutions and seeing where there are protections and also seeing where there are vulnerabilities.
I'll
Alice,
one
please.
thing really quickly, which is that looking back over the past few decades, I would say the 4 states and maybe soon to be 5 that have passed independent redistricting, that is a really historic change, because to remake the state legislature so that it better reflects public preference is a huge improvement to representative democracy.
We're getting near to the end, so I'm going to combine a few questions to make sure that we have time to hear from everybody. There's a question about whether the use of direct democracy has expanded in recent years, and should it expand? And then a question, is direct democracy an alternative to partisan gridlock in legislatures? If not, what other kinds of challenges does it present?
Well, I'll throw just a couple thoughts on that. So I don't think it's dramatically grown in recent years. If recent years means, you know, the last 10 years or so, it's always been there. It's always been going on. I think I think there should be more of it. You know, getting to the partisan point, and this is a point that I made in my book. If anybody's interested in hearing more about this, but not everybody's going to agree with this view. But I think the opinion polls tell us the voters are much more centrist than the elected officials that they're actually getting. They're getting people that are much more to the left or to the right of them. And I think the voters want to see middle policies much more than they get, and they're unable to get it out of what they have. And I believe that if voters actually have the chance to vote on issues, they will force policies toward the center. And I think that would be a very healthy thing. I think it's really important to recognize for American audiences is that there's something very unusual and out of step about this great country that we live in right now, is that we don't have any direct democracy at the federal level. And this puts us among a vanishingly small number of countries in the world. Two or three now don't. In this country, the voters have never been allowed to vote on an issue at the national level, ever. And again, this is super rare. And I think it's something we should reflect on a bit, because we are the country that pioneered democracy in the world, and we're behind the curve now. Everybody else says, let's take votes on things, and we don't do it. I think it would actually help us to actually bring policies back toward a more central position if we could vote on things more.
Great. Alice, can I pull you in as well?
Yeah, sure. Just to add to that I think that direct democracy, sometimes in legislatures, you have a kind of gamesmanship, like one side doesn't want the other side to solve a problem. And so even if we could have consensus on a particular issue, it just doesn't get through the legislature. And I think what direct democracy allows is for citizens to come together on areas of consensus around a particular issue in a way that cuts through the gamesmanship.
I'll be the Debbie Downer and just say, in
One in
terms
every room.
of challenges presented by relying on ballot measures to kind of affect the will of the people, one would be that because the education effort is so massive and the court challenges are becoming so voluminous, it takes a lot of money to do these. And especially like California always has a lot of ballot measures. it is so expensive to run statewide campaigns in a state like California in those media markets that cost a lot of money. And so what you see overall, and especially in California over the years, is that the side that has the most money wins, because they're the ones that can get their message out more effectively. And so like, that's just something that I pay attention to when I'm looking at ballot measures. And just something to be aware of, you know, while they're great and we love having the opportunity to vote on them for those of us who do, they are, just like the rest of our politics, susceptible to kind of the influence of outside money and special interests.
That's a great point. And maybe just building on that, I might ask the whole group, what advice do you give to voters to prepare for what might be on the ballot? And that's both voters in initiative states where there are direct democracy provisions, also voters in other states where state constitutional amendments, even if they're referred from the legislature, might still be coming before voters on the ballot. What should voters do?
Well, I would say if you're watching this now or any time before the election and there's a ballot measure that you care about, it is not too late to get involved in trying to impact the outcome. The education push goes up until people are, you know, the polls are closed. So if there's something in a state where you're in, or a state you used to live in, or a state where you have a lot of friends and family, that's very important to you this year, there's a group out there working on it, and there's a way to get involved right up until people are casting their votes.
Yeah, just to kind of repeat what we've been saying, find your trusted sources and figure out how you want to vote before you go into the ballot booth.
And just echoing what Alice said, what should voters do? Don't just walk in there and read the ballot description. Don't just listen to the TV commercial. Figure out somebody you trust and what they say, and figure out how to vote based on that.
And talk to other people in your community so that they do too.
Yes.
Well, so this has been a great conversation. I want to just give one final chance for everyone to just have a final word. If, you know, in a few sentences, what is the thing you want our audience to walk away from this afternoon based on this conversation? John, I'll start with you.
Okay, start with me.
No pressure.
Okay, yeah, no. I think that people, I hope people come away thinking that this is actually something that it's good we have the opportunity to do this. I think what we pointed out very well, that it's not a perfect system, and it's going to have some flaws to it. It's like all forms of democracy. You know, it's an imperfect system. But I hope people come away with the notion that we're better. Our democracy is incrementally better off by having this as a supplement to our representatives than if we didn't have it. And we should make sure that when we're voting, we need to make sure to protect the rights to actually vote on issues.
And to build on this, because I don't think it came up in the discussion, citizens have done some really important things through ballot initiatives in recent years, not just on reproductive rights, but Medicaid expansion, which has been critical for so many citizens, minimum wage increases, worker protection. So it's really, you know, it's a broad tool.
Oh, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. My parting wisdom, if I have any, would be that if there are measures on your ballot, please vote on them. A lot of people skip them. They are confusing. You have enough time to kind of find those trusted sources, look at what it might mean for you in your life, and to be sure and vote on them either way, because that's an opportunity that not everyone in this country has.
Thank you so much to our panelists and to our audience for all of the great questions. I'll just end us there by saying the Brennan Center looks forward to seeing you at future events. We hope you'll join us to be the first to know when events are announced. You can sign up for our events newsletter at brennancenter.org/events. I'm Alicia Bannon, Editor-in-Chief of State Court Report. Thank you again for joining us for this conversation.